Dear Madam or Sir, I am Christian Loos and I am delighted to be able to speak to you today. Thank you very much for the invitation. Why are institutional ethical considerations relevant? I would like to give you two examples. The transformation of the existing energy and traffic system as a result of threat and negative consequences of the climate change, or the measures to contain the corona pandemic, go beyond what can be grasped by a purely individualistic ethics. Responsibility must primarily be ascribed to social institutions, and the question of willingness to take risks must be answered in a democratic way of deliberation. I refer to Jürgen Habermas. Institutional action is understood as supra-individual action. The difference to individualistic types of ethics can be illustrated with the terminology of game theory. In the latter, the implementation of moral norms is incumbent on the motivational, decision-making preferences of the individual. In institutional ethics, the rules of the game are focused as framework conditions. The ethical norms inscribed in the rules of the game are binding for everyone involved in the institution. In order to narrow down the concept of institutions, it makes sense to understand them as organizations. In my lecture, I will primarily focus on the democratic institutions of the state. Conventions, rules, and roles are constitutive elements of institutions. Institutions, in turn, and I would like to quote from Stanford Encyclopedia, need to be distinguished from more complex and more complete social entities, such as societies or cultures, of which any given institution is typically a constitutive element. End of the citation. Governments, for example, can be called meta-institutions. They organize other institutions, which can include specific systems of organizations. The term organization almost refers to a particular token, but institutions are more than that. As organizations, institutions have a central and important role to play in or for a society. They are long-lasting, typically transgenerational, dynamic, and evolving entities. As such, they have a history, the diachronic structure of a narrative, and usually a partially open-ended future. Institutions require acceptance by the population and or their users. Aside from the formal and usually explicitly stated or defined tasks and rules, there is an important implicit and informal dimension of an institution which you can describe as an institutional culture. Institutions are characterized by habitualized action, with the motivation to act being shaped by repeated individual acts. Institutions refer to the laws of human behavior. In this context, John O'Neill also speaks of body logical systems. According to Rahel Yegi, institutions can reach into forms of life, determine and stabilize them, and vice versa. From my point of view, forms of life and institutions do not form disjoint areas, but rather a continuum. Democratic institutions and democratic ways of life often go hand in hand. In reference to Arnold Gehlen, one can discern a dichotomy in relation to institutions. The ritualized and the aesthetic are subsumed under the area of the non-functional. For Gehlen, the institutional binding power consists precisely in these non-functional, for example, in the ritualized elements. According to Gehlen, a uniform, for example, would have a direct influence on the behavior of others, regardless of the specific quality of its wearer. In this sense, the non-functional would be decisive for the properties of durability, persistence, and stability. I cannot agree with Gehlen's considerations. On the one hand, I consider institutional functionality to be an intrinsic value as well. On the other hand, I see a danger in dichotomous drafts of trivializing dysfunctionalities. The example of the uniform makes this perspective clear. It is true that citizens perceive a person wearing a uniform differently than someone who is not wearing a uniform because of the uniform. If, however, uniform wearers behave dysfunctionally, not appropriate, and relatively as inconsistently with the tasks and the values of the institutions, then the respect for the uniform will rapidly decline and possibly even turn into an enemy image, provided that the tasks and values of the institutions reflect the rule of law of citizenship. Gehlen, like others, assume that institutions have relief strategies. The responsibility of the individual to make important decisions do not apply in the sense of the institutionally guaranteed practice. That must be vehemently contradicted. From the hospital to the police, to the marriage and the democratic way of life, institutions everywhere help us to make our lives easier and safer, but everyday professional life demands a high degree of individual responsibility, including in an institutional context. Against this background, it can be argued that institutions should convey a professional and well-reflected institutional ethos to their members. The institutions must ensure that this can happen. Their functionality must guarantee that their members do not have to be permanently entangled in fundamental emotional decisions. I argue that professional and institutional ethos must correspond. The setting of a certain permanence is, from an ontological point of view, just as much a part of the essence of institutions as their tendencies towards autonomy. As a rule, when considering institutional ethics, a distinction is made between the motivation and purpose of the institutions. Since institutions are also dynamic structures, despite all persistence and continuity efforts, the original motivation can be given up due to new purposes. Ideally, for reasons of transparency, motivation and purpose should correspond. If a purpose changes, it must be justified, otherwise an inconsistency with the original motivation can be denounced. Institutions have their own internal laws and norms. You can generate needs internally as well as externally, or you can influence them. Gehlen assumes, for example, that institutions establish a specific ethos in the sense of behavioral conventions on the basis of which deviant behavior can be sanctioned. If the ethos and the sanction system based on it collapse into a hermetically sealed unit, then duties within the institution that are actually to be justified can no longer be criticized and falsified from the outside. However, if the original motivation and purpose provided for an opportunity for external criticism, then such institutions can be described as dysfunctional. Dysfunctional institutions that are also, for instance, historically obsolete with regard to technical progress, or have colonized other contexts of action, which go beyond their own capabilities, are ethically unacceptable. This issue becomes more explosive when some of the actors involved are of the opinion that the regulatory measures are illegal, inconsistent, paternalistic interventions, regulations, or bans. In a state of emergency, as much of the democratic process as possible must be preserved. In order to protect and correct democratic institutions, it is necessary to face the inconsistencies transparently and honestly. In my opinion, non-reflected inconsistencies are a sign of dysfunctionality of institutions or support a process of becoming dysfunctional. It is the task of ethics in application to track down these inconsistencies and to reflect them critically in a constructive manner. There is definitely a need for interdisciplinary cooperation in order to identify dysfunctionalities at an early stage. An acceptability test must assess whether the relevant institutions can be regarded as functional and appropriate to their specific context. Acceptability means, on the one hand, justified ability to develop acceptance, and on the other hand, intersubjective appropriateness. By the latter, I understand practical coherence and social proportionality. The concept of ethical acceptability provides an offer of practical philosophy for the social discourse to check acceptability. As an instant of critical reflection, ethics in application is neither about obtaining acceptance nor about determining possible or expected acceptance. For an acceptability check, I propose 7 principles at this point of time. Justice, the ethical standards of decision-making under uncertainty, respect for autonomy, reasonableness, contextuality and appropriateness, the ethical responsiveness, and the functionality of institutions. Today I spoke about the latter principle. I advocate make democratic institutions great again. And in this way, we can hopefully prevent democratic lifestyles from becoming soiled. We can achieve this if we sincerely reflect on their dysfunctionalities. Thank you very much for your attention.